Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by SpeedStream. I'm Jim Cardle. With Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin representing 4 of the nation's top 10 largest cities in terms of economic development, and with virtually 1,000 people moving into the state every day, citizens across Texas are experiencing greater and greater congestion and traffic disruption. State Senator Robert Nichols is chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee and is also a former commissioner of TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation. What can Texans expect for future traffic congestion, and what is Texas trying to do about it? We're pleased to be able to visit today with State Senator Robert Nichols, chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee. Senator, thanks for coming in and joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
I mentioned a couple things about your experience in your intro. You've devoted a good part of your career to transportation and building the infrastructure in Texas. But if I can first, just more of a general question for our listeners, because it is a complex issue. But tell us first, if you can, what are the transportation funding issues in Texas, or particularly why is there currently a transportation funding problem for Texas?
It's a combination of events. Most people are aware of the fuel tax of 20 cents a gallon. They're not aware that it has been 20 cents a gallon since 1991. And so it has not adjusted for inflation. It has not adjusted for increased mileage on your vehicle. So you are actually paying less in taxes per mile while you're driving. Your vehicle registration fees have stayed identical since 1991. And so your construction cost index has increased 150% plus since that time, and there has not been adjustment. So the money that's coming in for your constitutionally dedicated revenue streams, the purchasing power has been dropping, and it's dropping at the same time that the demands on the highway have increased. People kind of forget that roads and bridges don't last forever. They last about 40 years, and then they have to be rebuilt, and they have to be maintained in the meantime. So the cost to rebuild and maintain over a 40-year period is really about 3 times original construction. If you look around, the farm-to-market system, 42,000 miles, and the interstate system were all built and completed more than 40 years ago. So as we're going through this aging process of rebuilding roads, we're at the same time where population is coming into the state, into the urbanized areas primarily, so which gives you a tremendous congestion problem. Mm-hmm. And so we crossed the line where the revenues coming into the state no longer will pay to even preserve the system. That line crossed about 10 or 12 years ago. And what the legislature has been doing for the past 12 years or 11 years is borrowing approximately $2 billion a year to build what we have been building. So we created a $20 billion debt. The legislature said, we're not going to borrow any more money. We've got to solve this problem.
Talk about, you mentioned there the debt and the cost of living, but also the population growth. We're so proud of Texas's economy. It's seemingly getting better every day, but just the massive numbers of influx. What kind of stress is that putting on the system?
It's a lot. You've got 96% of those people, from the census as I understand it, are moving into the urbanized areas, mm-hmm. where your highway congestion is already there. And so that puts even more, so it's a combination of more traffic, age, inflation, and it's primarily in the urbanized areas for the congestion. But you also have to be connected. I mean, if you're in Dallas, you want to be able to get to Houston or to Austin or all these places. And arteries like I-35 are getting choked up from one end to the other.
Okay, so we're talking about Proposition 1 coming on the ballot. Everybody will be voting here during the November election. You've laid out some of the details about what the problem is. Talk, if you can, particularly about Prop 1. How is it going to address some of these issues that you've talked about without getting too much into the weeds?
Well, we're estimating the shortfall. Everybody seems to be in agreement. We're between $4 billion and $5 billion per year shortfall. You would come up with that math if you just adjusted for inflation.
Is that for growth and maintenance or both?
It's a combination of both.
Okay.
You've got to be able to preserve the system, but we want to make sure our congestion doesn't get worse.
Yeah.
And we want to not build up more debt to do that. And so what Proposition 1 does, there has been one financial dynamic in the state that dramatically changed in the last few years, and that's the oil and gas expansion and production from fracking. We're very fortunate. And the oil and gas producers pay the state a tax on a percentage of that production, the value. It's called a severance tax. And so we had the idea to capture a portion of that tax and constitutionally dedicate it to non-towed roads and bridges of this state.
Okay.
And that's what Prop 1 does.
So it's constitutionally, which is a key aspect
Right.
of, for instance, people will be aware of Governor Ann Richards' initiation with devoting gambling funds or lottery funds to education, but you're doing this constitutionally, and it's still going to maintain rainy day fund balances and so forth, correct?
Sure.
Talk about that if you can for a minute.
Okay. Money that goes in a rainy day fund, that's a separate account. It's like dollars in a silo. It doesn't change. It takes 2/3 of the legislature to vote to spend that money.
Okay.
So we're not touching, it doesn't touch that at all. Once a year, a deposit is made based on calculations on the oil and gas severance tax. What this does is it splits the deposit
Okay.
so that you always put money in the rainy day fund, but you also put money into roads and bridges of the state. And it being constitutionally dedicated, the members and financial, in our budgeting process, they can't put it anywhere else. The voters say it must go to transportation. That is where it will go. And it's the roads and bridges of the system.
Probably not a bad thing for the constituents of Texas to be tying the legislators' hands. I appreciate your effort there. I think most folks will. Folks, I want to remind you again, we're visiting with Chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, Senator Robert Nichols from East Texas. Senator, if I can ask you just another question, perhaps in a more generic and marketing issue. We were talking a little bit before sitting down. This is a commonly known problem, but yet it's a hard sell to try and get people to focus on it. You were mentioning that even members of the legislature are having trouble getting familiar with the specific issues in their area. Tell us exactly what some of the specifics are that will solve transportation with Prop 1.
Well, if we're not going to borrow money anymore, and we said we do not want to, that seemed to be the general consensus,
Okay.
then that you're to a pay-as-you-go system. If this does not pass, then the revenues that TxDOT has will no longer, not only will you not have the money to build new capacity,
Okay.
we would not have the money to preserve the existing system. You would slowly have a deteriorating system. Your traditional revenues go up at an angle.
Okay.
The cost to preserve the system is at an angle even steeper. And the cost to preserve is increased traffic, age, inflation, things of that nature, increased weights.
Mm-hmm.
Those lines crossed 10 years ago. I think I mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have one extra factor, and that is we have debt service. So we would actually be worse off than we were 10 years ago.
Okay.
And it would not be a pretty thing.
So let me ask you maybe a more direct question, not to put you on the spot per se, but two things. For instance, will any rainy day funds, there's a lot of misperception out there perhaps that this is going to impact the rainy day fund in a negative way, number one. And number two, does it affect things like the gas tax?
It doesn't affect the gas tax. It doesn't
Okay.
raise your taxes.
Okay.
These are fees, the one dynamic in the state that really changed, and it changed in the last 10 years, is the total amount of money coming in. In other words, if this passes, like specifically this November,
Okay.
you would write a check of 1.7 and put it into the rainy day fund. And you would write a check of 1.7 and put it into transportation.
And the rainy day fund allocation
It's
was
never
gonna
touched.
go there anyway. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we can just wrap up, and you're gonna be traveling the state, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, because I know you are traveling, where folks might be seeing you or some
Well,
of your
myself,
activities.
Chairman Joe Pickett, and others, we're trying to go out and explain to different groups around the state.
Good.
News people, chambers of commerces, anybody that'll listen, Texas Municipal League, County Association, things of that nature.
Is it on their radar screen?
Yes, it's getting on the radar screen, and there's gonna be a lot more awareness of it in the coming months, so. And that's a good thing. People should be engaged, they need to understand, and, hopefully this will pass, hope the voters support it. And then next session, remember, we're only solving part of the problem here. It's a big step in the right direction, then we need to come up next session and solve this problem.
Well, we're glad you're gonna be around to help continue solving that problem. I know you're on the ballot this time, but I assume your reelection chances are looking fairly decent based on your work there, and we wanna have you back. We appreciate
Thank you
you
very
coming in.
much. I appreciate it.
Folks, Senator Robert Nichols, Chairman of the Senate Transportation Committee, be sure and stay focused on Prop 1 prior to November, and we want to thank you for tuning in for this issue of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by SpeedStream. Remember, you're either an insider or you're not. I'm Jim Cardle. Thanks for joining us.